What happens when everything you believe turns out to be a lie? My name is Nadia Qureshi, and I live in a quiet suburb on the outskirts of Willowdale. I never imagined I would be sharing such a personal story, but I also never imagined experiencing something so profound that it would shatter the foundations of everything I believed. Before this happened, I was 41 years old, married, with 3 children, and completely devoted to my Islamic faith. My husband, Hassan, and I had built what we considered a strong and respectable life in our community. I worked as a product manager at a local manufacturing company, focusing on inventory oversight. We distributed a range of items that required careful tracking, and one of my tasks involved verifying shipments when they arrived. Although the job was not glamorous, I took pride in performing it carefully and methodically, knowing that attention to detail mattered. My days were filled with emails, spreadsheets, phone calls, and quick glances at the digital tracking systems that updated us on product arrivals and departures. I had gotten used to the rhythm: daily checks, weekly reports, monthly evaluations. It all felt like a cycle that would go on forever. From a religious standpoint, I was as devout as anyone you might meet. I prayed 5 times a day without fail. I fasted diligently during Ramadan. I gave zakat with a heart that I believed was generous and sincere. I even managed to perform the Hajj pilgrimage twice. Once shortly after I was first married, and again about 5 years later, when our youngest child could stay with relatives. The spiritual satisfaction I felt during those pilgrimages was profound. Circling the Kaaba, among throngs of other believers, I felt connected to a tradition I had always assumed would ensure my salvation. But I was not just a passive participant in my faith. I was also active in our local religious community. I volunteered at the Willowdale Islamic Center every weekend, helping to organize programs for children. I taught them how to recite verses from the Quran, how to perform ablutions correctly, how to face the Qibla, and how to pray with the right posture and intention. If someone had asked me at the time, I would have said I was absolutely certain of my path to heaven. My devotion felt unassailable. My hijab was my armor against sin and worldly temptations, a symbol of modesty and submission that I wore with unwavering conviction. I remember the day before my life changed forever, as if it were a scene from a movie. It was a Tuesday morning in early August, specifically August 4th, and the weather in Willowdale was slightly cool at dawn. I woke up at 5 a.m. to perform my Fajr prayer, reciting the same verses I had memorized decades earlier. My oldest child needed help finishing a school project, so I spent an hour proofreading their work on modern world history. My other 2 children were still asleep, though they would soon wake for their daily routines. Then I brewed some tea, thinking the day ahead would be ordinary, like every other day in my well-structured life. Little did I know that an event was unfolding that would upend my beliefs and plunge me into a near-death experience. That day at my company, we had received a large shipment of new products. Part of my job was to ensure the inventory numbers on the invoice matched what we actually received. I spent the morning going through digital records, then physically examining some sample boxes in our storage area. Everything seemed normal until I descended into the basement level, a place I had been many times before. Our building was older, and the basement was cramped with tall metal shelving units stocked with boxes, some of them containing documentation, others containing old product prototypes, and some earmarked for immediate distribution. Without my knowledge, there had been a slow gas leak from a corroded pipe near the basement's ventilation system. This building, while serviceable, had definitely seen better days, and repeated budget cuts for maintenance meant that small issues sometimes lingered until they became large problems. Late the previous night, that corroded pipe had begun leaking carbon monoxide. The ventilation system in the basement malfunctioned just enough to allow dangerous levels of the gas to build up. As I walked downstairs, all I could think about was verifying that the shipping manifest matched our records. It never crossed my mind that I might be stepping into a lethal situation. The time was around 8:50 a.m. when I entered the cramped basement space. The boxes were packed unevenly on the shelves, and the lighting had always been a bit unreliable down there. As soon as I walked in, I noticed a slight dizziness, but I told myself I had probably not eaten enough breakfast. My plan was to finish my verification quickly, then head back upstairs for a proper meal. But as I moved among the shelves, scanning inventory tags, my breath became labored. The fluorescent lights flickered in a manner that made me squint uncomfortably, and a faint pounding started behind my temples. Despite these warning signs, I carried on. There was a discrepancy between the shipping paperwork and the boxes I was counting. I found that puzzling because it suggested either a clerical error or a shipment error. Either scenario could have serious implications for my departmental budget. Consumed by the worry of sorting it out, I crouched down to check a label on the lower shelf. Suddenly, the room spun violently. The clipboard I was carrying slipped from my fingers and clattered on the floor. My vision blurred, and my chest tightened as though some heavy weight were pressing down, making each breath feel insufficient. In desperation, I reached for my phone, but my arms felt like they were submerged in thick molasses. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, faster and louder with each second. The wall seemed to tilt away from me. My last coherent thought was the plea, "Ya Allah, help me," before everything went black. It felt like the world had vanished into a suffocating tunnel of darkness. What followed was something the medical staff later termed a clinical death or near-death experience. To me, those words seemed far too clinical to capture the unimaginable reality of what I went through. In the moments after my heart stopped, moments that stretched beyond normal bounds of time, I became acutely aware of an entirely different realm of existence. Medical records indicate my heart was not beating for over 20 minutes, and I was not breathing. The paramedics who arrived on the scene, alerted by my coworker Amara, found me unresponsive on the cold concrete floor. Amara had rushed downstairs when she noticed I was late returning from what should have been a quick inventory check. Had she not found me, I would have been pronounced dead even sooner. When the paramedics arrived, they worked frantically to revive me. They administered oxygen, attempted CPR, used a defibrillator, and performed other emergency procedures. My coworkers hovered anxiously at the doorway. By the time they got a faint heartbeat, more than 23 minutes had elapsed. I was rushed to the hospital and placed in the ICU, where doctors were unsure whether I would survive or suffer irreversible brain damage. But all of that is secondary to what happened to me on a spiritual level. While my physical body lay lifeless, my consciousness was catapulted into a realm I had never known existed. I found myself looking down at the scene in the basement. I could see Amara, her face pale, tears in her eyes, pumping my chest in a desperate attempt to keep blood flowing. The paramedics rushed in with their kits, their voices a clamor of instructions. Yet from my vantage point, I heard them as though submerged in water, distant and distorted. Strangely, I felt no fear. Instead, there was this all-encompassing sense of peace and wonder. It was like stepping into a dimension where my earthly anxieties could no longer reach me. The walls of the basement, the cluttered shelves, the frantic paramedics, all of it appeared almost like a backdrop fading into insignificance. I felt a presence, a compelling pull urging me upward, through the ceiling, through layers of reality that might as well have been invisible to my earthly senses. I had been taught in Islam about angels who would question the dead. I expected to encounter them, Munkar and Nakir, if my beliefs were correct. But that was not what happened. Instead, I found myself traversing a tunnel, but not the warm, beckoning, light-filled tunnel people often describe in near-death experiences. This tunnel seemed to vibrate with an energy that pulsed in waves. There were moments of brightness interspersed with patches of darkness, so profound it felt like they swallowed any vestige of light. As I drifted along, it was as though I was being shown a grand tapestry of my life. Memories flickered in front of me, like a panoramic movie. My childhood days of reciting Quranic verses, my teenage years making jokes with friends about how Christians believed in the Trinity, my adult years, where I had strived to follow Islamic law precisely. Yet none of these memories appeared in a comforting or reassuring light. Instead, I felt convicted, seeing how my mocking dismissal of Christian claims was not just an offhand teenage folly, but a moment loaded with spiritual significance. It was as if every belittling comment and every rejection of Christian claims about Jesus being God had weight in some cosmic measure of truth. The further I went, the more revelations came. I saw the countless times I had taught Islamic studies to children, urging them to disregard the notion that Jesus could be the divine Son of God, insisting that Islam was the final and most complete path, that Prophet Muhammad was the seal of the prophets. Those lessons I had imparted had invisible consequences in the spiritual realm, strings weaving a tapestry I had never imagined. I felt a deep shame, as if a bright, searing light was shining directly on the falsehoods I had embraced and spread, intensifying my realization that I had led others away from something critical. Suddenly, the tunnel gave way to what I can only describe as a cosmic courtroom. There were no literal walls or judges in robes, but the atmosphere had a solemn finality to it, a sense of ultimate authority. The space, if it can be called that, was made of a living luminescence. Everything shimmered, and I felt unworthy even to gaze upon it. In the center of this setting was a figure of such radiance and majesty that my soul trembled to behold him. Even without being told, I instinctively knew this was Jesus Christ, revealed in the fullness of his divine glory. This was not the mere Isa I had been taught about in Islam, revered as a prophet but never as God. Here he stood as something infinitely greater. The Creator, the King, the Alpha and the Omega. Off to one side, I perceived another presence that bore the label I had once given to the supreme being in Islam, Allah. But it was twisted and dark, with an energy that felt oppressive, not holy. This entity seemed subservient to an even darker force behind it, and I realized, with unspeakable horror, that what I had accepted as Allah was not the true God. My entire lifetime of devotion had been directed toward a deception. Scenes played out before my eyes revealing how Muhammad had been misled, how the Quran contained half-truths mixed with lies, and how these distortions had led millions, including me, away from the genuine God. I wanted to look away, to run, but I was held in place by the overwhelming presence of love emanating from the majestic figure of Christ. It was love unlike anything I had ever encountered. It was both tender and fierce, gentle and unyielding, a consuming fire of holiness that burned away illusions. The realization tore me apart inside. I had been worshiping in the wrong direction my entire life, offering my prayers to a false reflection. Every sujud, every rak'ah, every carefully memorized surah, none of it had connected me to the real deity I was now seeing. In that moment, it became clear that the prayers of devout Muslims everywhere, though sincerely offered, were being intercepted by powers of darkness masquerading as divine. The Kaaba, which I had circled with fervent devotion during Hajj, appeared in a vision before me as a focus of profound spiritual confusion. I saw streams of energy moving from worshippers to a shadowy presence that thrived on humanity's misguided offerings. The sorrow that washed over me was almost unbearable. So many of my loved ones, my friends, my extended family, and countless others were pouring their hearts into a religion that was ultimately leading them away from salvation. As these visions intensified, I found myself confronted by an entire panorama of Christian truth. I saw the early apostles preaching about Jesus' divinity, the establishment of the church, the formulation of the sacraments. I witnessed baptisms performed by the earliest Christians, seeing how they weren't mere symbolic acts, but channels of real grace that changed the spiritual substance of the one being baptized. I beheld the Eucharist in a new light, not as a symbolic meal, but as the actual body and blood of Christ. An unfathomable mystery that bridged the gap between earth and heaven. Wave after wave of understanding washed over me, each revelation accompanied by a sense of awe and, at times, terror. I was shown how partial truths existed in countless philosophies, but only the genuine Christian faith contained the fullness of what was needed for salvation. Protestant communities, though often sincere in their love for Jesus, lacked vital elements like apostolic succession and the completeness of the sacraments. Other religions, from Judaism to various Eastern philosophies, appeared as roads that, while sometimes leading to admirable moral or ethical systems, did not bring people into the saving relationship with the true God that was required for eternal life. I saw, with startling clarity, the spiritual ramifications for those who choose to follow incomplete or outright false teachings. Hell was not merely an abstract notion or a place of ephemeral discomfort. It was a realm of unending separation from God's presence, filled with torment that included a literal fire. In my NDE state, I beheld souls trapped in burning darkness, fully aware of the truth they had rejected, but forever unable to cross the divide. This fire was not symbolic, but real and excruciating, an outward manifestation of the spiritual agony of having definitively turned away from perfect love and holiness. Though terrifying, it was also just, for it reflected the righteous judgment of a God who both loves and respects the free will of his creatures to accept or refuse him. At one point, I saw glimpses of the end times. Not the eschatology I had learned in Islam, where a figure called the Mahdi would come, but the actual sequence foretold in Christian scriptures. Current world events, the moral decay, the wars, and confusions over identity all appeared to align with the biblical prophecies in ways I had never been aware of. I grasped how the Islamic portrayal of the end times was a carefully crafted counterfeit, orchestrated by evil spiritual forces to mislead millions into missing the true signs of Christ's final victory. The longer this experience continued, the more I realized that my acceptance of Christ as God was not optional. Without a true connection to him, all my righteous deeds and devotions were as dust. I had tried to earn heaven by following the 5 pillars of Islam, but now I saw that no human effort could suffice to reach a God who is infinitely holy. It had to be through Jesus, through his sacrifice, through his real presence, and through the sacraments he established. Any other path would, sooner or later, end in destruction. Another vision formed, showing me my own family. My husband Hassan, my 3 children, the neighbors, and the friends who had stood beside us in prayer gatherings. They were still carrying on in the same old routines, unaware that the foundation of their faith was built on sand. The heartbreak of knowing they might one day face the same horrifying truth I was being shown, only without a chance to turn back, pressed on me with a terrible weight. I wanted to scream, to warn them, to shake them out of their slumber. But I was just an onlooker, trapped between worlds. At some point, the presence of Christ poured out a comforting assurance into my soul, conveying that while I had been deceived, the love of God was reaching out to me still, providing a chance to embrace the truth and share it. I saw how sinners of every stripe, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, atheist, or nominal Christian, could be saved through genuine repentance and acceptance of Christ. The difference was that Islam and other false systems actively steered believers away from that necessary step. Then came the moment of return. It was abrupt, like being yanked backward through the tunnel. I felt a rush of confusion, then a heavy weight on my chest. My eyes blinked open to harsh fluorescent lights, and I realized I was in a hospital room. Machines beeped rhythmically around me, and I could just barely see Hassan's anxious face at the foot of the bed. My first conscious thought was not about medical explanations or relief at being alive. Instead, I was overwhelmed by the memory. It was all real. Everything I had seen on the other side was more vivid, more substantial than anything in this world. The doctors and nurses seemed astonished at my survival. Given how long my heart had stopped, they feared severe brain damage or total organ failure. Yet I was awake, coherent, and to their surprise, my cognitive tests showed no deficits. Physically, I was weak. My muscles felt like jelly, and I had headaches that would come and go, but I was alive, and with full mental function. Hassan was euphoric at first, repeatedly thanking Allah for my survival. When I tried to speak, my voice came out hoarse and wavering, so I waited a day or two before attempting to share what had happened. In those quiet hours, I prayed, a real, heartfelt prayer, to the God I had encountered. I hardly knew how to pray in a Christian sense, so I just poured out my heart, thanking him for mercy, for opening my eyes, for giving me another chance. Tears of both gratitude and sorrow soaked my hospital pillow. When I finally told my husband everything, the reaction was even more tumultuous than I had feared. He looked at me with dismay, convinced I must be in some delirium caused by oxygen deprivation. He tried to reason that I was still in a vulnerable state, that I needed rest and spiritual counseling to come back to Islam. But I was resolute. I knew what I had seen. No explanation could reduce the clarity of that revelation. My older children responded with a mix of confusion and anger. My eldest stormed out of the room, refusing to hear another word, while my middle child stared at me with tears in her eyes, heartbroken that the mother she revered was now talking about Jesus as God. Only my youngest, still in elementary school, listened quietly with an open mind, though I could see the tension and bewilderment in their face. Word spread quickly in our community. The Willowdale Islamic Center's imam came to visit, expecting to comfort me or perhaps guide me in a renewed commitment to Islam. Instead, I confessed to him that I had seen the terrifying truth, that our prayers were being misdirected, that the Kaaba was not the true center of divine worship, and that Jesus Christ was the Lord of all. He tried to remain polite, but I could see the grief in his eyes. Perhaps he thought it was a form of madness or a test from Allah. He didn't argue much. He simply said he would pray for my recovery, then left, shaking his head in sorrow. After several weeks in the hospital, I was discharged to continue my recovery at home. Adjusting to normal life after an experience like that was disorienting. The house felt the same. My children's laughter and bickering were the same. The hum of the kitchen appliances and the rattle of the old air conditioner were all the same. But I was not the same person. My entire perspective had changed. I felt as if I was seeing everything through new eyes. Eyes that recognized how temporary and fragile this earthly life really is. Even tasks like cooking or watching television struck me as bizarrely unimportant compared to the eternal significance of choosing the right path for one's soul. I knew I needed to find a Christian church that aligned with the fullness of truth I had been shown. But how to begin? I had spent decades studying Islamic texts, the Quran, the Hadith. I knew little about the intricacies of Christian theology beyond the Muslim argument that the Bible had been corrupted. Yet every time I thought about picking up a Quran, I felt an almost physical revulsion, remembering how it had been part of the deception that led me so close to eternal separation from God. Instead, I began to research local churches online, reading about their doctrines. I prayed earnestly, Jesus, show me where your full truth is preserved. Lead me to the community that worships you in spirit and in truth. My search eventually led me to a church that traced its roots back to the earliest Christian traditions, one that embraced apostolic succession and placed a strong emphasis on the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Nervous but determined, I walked in one Sunday morning. I still wore a headscarf out of habit, though not a strict hijab. People greeted me warmly, and I wondered if they could sense my spiritual hunger. During the service, I was overcome with a sense of awe and peace that felt reminiscent of my experience in that cosmic courtroom. The readings from Scripture spoke directly to my heart, especially the passages about Jesus being the bread of life, about abiding in Him to have eternal life. When I witnessed how they treated the Eucharist, with reverence, as though they were truly handling the body and blood of God, I felt tears welling up again. I met with the priest afterward, a gentle man who listened patiently as I recounted my entire near-death experience. To my relief, he did not dismiss me as delusional or overwrought. He asked some clarifying questions, checking how consistent my statements were with Orthodox Christian teaching. Then he guided me gently through a process of catechesis, a deeper study of what the Church taught about God, Jesus, salvation, the sacraments, and moral living. It was overwhelming. Part of me felt exhilarated to finally learn the truths I had once mocked. Part of me grieved for the wasted years I had spent in error. Converting, as one might expect, came at a tremendous personal cost. My husband Hassan was aghast at my decision, convinced that I had been brainwashed. Over time, our relationship became strained. He argued, prayed, and pleaded with me to reconsider. When he saw that I was resolute, he threatened to leave. Only our children seemed to keep him from making an abrupt departure. My extended family, including many relatives in other cities, all but disowned me when they heard of my conversion. The social ostracism was painful. The few friends who tried to talk me out of it soon fell away when they realized I was not going to be talked back into Islam. I cried many nights, not because I doubted what I had witnessed, but because it hurt to be so isolated from the people I loved. Yet in the midst of that pain, I recalled the overwhelming love I felt emanating from Christ in that spiritual realm. It was enough to sustain me and remind me that sometimes love means telling hard truths. It also means living those truths, even when they come at great personal sacrifice. Slowly, my middle child began speaking to me again, asking questions about Jesus, the cross, and how it could be that God would come in the form of a man. I tried my best to give humble, earnest answers, sometimes turning to passages in the Bible or referencing the early church councils that define the nature of Christ. My youngest child listened in on these discussions, wide-eyed with a mixture of curiosity and bewilderment. My eldest, however, remained cold, leaving the room whenever the topic came up. Despite the strain at home, each Sunday I found solace in attending Mass. The highlight of my week became receiving the Eucharist, tears often sliding down my cheeks as I remembered the cosmic glory of Christ. The church community embraced me with a warmth I had never expected. They understood that I was losing nearly everything: friends, extended family, and possibly my marriage, because of my decision to become a Christian. Their support and prayers were lifelines, reminding me that I was part of a spiritual family that transcended blood ties. Over time, I began to learn more about the Christian understanding of prayer: communal prayer in the liturgy, and personal prayer in private devotion. Whereas Islamic prayers had been ritualistic and formulaic, I now discovered prayer as a living conversation with a God who was both transcendent and intimately present. I spent hours on my knees, not chanting memorized verses, but simply talking to Jesus, asking for guidance and pouring out the yearnings of my heart. These prayer sessions often ended in a sense of peace that defied explanation. Eventually, my journey included formal catechism and baptism into the church. This time, I understood baptism as more than just water sprinkled or poured. From everything I had been shown in my near-death experience, I recognized it as a mystical transformation that reconfigured my soul's relationship with God. I felt a supernatural grace wash over me as the water touched my forehead, a warmth that seemed to penetrate to the core of my being, affirming that I was now truly reborn in Christ. All the while, I continued to reflect on what I had seen about hell, no longer just a place of spiritual separation, but also a reality involving literal, unimaginable fire. This knowledge made me all the more urgent in my prayers for others. I remembered the faces of devout Muslims in my old community, the extended family in other places, and even random people I had encountered in the mosque. They were sincere, as I had been, yet sincerity and falsehood does not spare one from the consequences of rejecting the ultimate truth. Each day I would beseech God to rescue them from the trap we had all once considered the peak of piety. At the same time, I had glimpses of the fate awaiting those from other backgrounds, whether atheists who deny any deity or adherents of other spiritual paths that do not acknowledge Jesus as Lord. The images of souls in that fiery realm of torment haunted me, urging me to share my testimony whenever possible, even if it meant I would be ridiculed. I wrote down my experiences, described them to Christian friends, shared them cautiously with a few inquirers who were on the fence about Islam or various other belief systems. Some listened with genuine interest, others scoffed, convinced I was either mentally unbalanced or making up stories for attention. While these reactions sometimes stung, I was comforted by the memory of that divine presence, the all-encompassing love that simultaneously broke and healed me. That love was enough to weather the loss of lifelong friendships, enough to stand firm even as I faced hostility from those who believed I had betrayed my upbringing, enough to forgive those who ridiculed me. Love was stronger than the storms swirling around me. In my quieter moments, I often recalled my vantage point above my lifeless body on the basement floor. I would reimagine the frantic compressions on my chest, see the paramedics shouting to each other, watch my coworker Amara crying while speaking to the 911 operator. The fact that I came back at all still leaves me in wonder. But then I remember that there was a purpose behind it. I was charged with sharing the truth about who Christ really is, about the terrifying reality of a real, fiery hell, about the deception of false religions, and about the infinite grace available to those willing to accept it. As my story began to spread, I met other converts, some from Islam, others from different religions, who had similarly profound encounters. Each testimony was unique, but the underlying theme was the same. Once someone truly experiences Christ, everything changes. All illusions fall away, leaving a stark decision: accept the truth, or cling to the lie and face the eternal consequence. It was sobering, but also profoundly hopeful. Every day, new souls are awakening to the truth about Jesus, stepping out of darkness and into the light. I will not pretend that life became easy or that all my problems resolved themselves neatly. My husband and I still live under the same roof, but we occupy different emotional and spiritual worlds. He tries to keep up appearances for the sake of our children, but there is a wall between us. Whether our marriage will survive long term, I do not know. Yet, even if it dissolves, I will stand firm in the truth, trusting that the love of Christ will sustain me. My two older children remain distanced, though they have mellowed somewhat over time, perhaps seeing that my transformation is not a passing phase. My youngest continues to ask me probing questions, and I see a genuine spiritual curiosity blossoming there. Looking back on my life, I sometimes grieve for the countless hours I spent in devotion to what I now understand was a demonic counterfeit. I mourn the friends who remain so certain in their Islamic beliefs, thinking I have turned traitor. But I also rest in the knowledge that God can reach anyone, anywhere, just as he reached me in the darkest depths of carbon monoxide poisoning. The main difference is whether a person is willing, when faced with the truth, to accept it. Yes, I occasionally feel fear when I think of how large a part of humanity remains in spiritual blindness. But then I remember that fear cannot stand in the presence of divine love. And so I pray with urgency, but without despair. Each new day is another opportunity for people to find the truth, if only they would open their hearts. Meanwhile, I persevere in receiving the Eucharist and uniting my prayers to the Church's liturgy, trusting that these sacraments are instruments through which God continues to pour out his grace upon the world. This is the truth I discovered. Salvation is not about checking off religious duties or blindly following a prophet who denies the divinity of Christ. It is about encountering the living God who took on flesh, died for our sins, rose again, and established his church so that we might share in his life-giving presence. I learned the hard way, through death itself, that everything short of that is spiritual emptiness, leading to the gates of a real hell, one ablaze with never-ending fire. I realize how shocking this might sound to someone still in the Islamic faith, or any other system that denies Jesus' divine nature. My plea is for you to seek the truth honestly. Ask God, with sincerity, to show you who he really is. If you do this wholeheartedly, he will answer. It might be through a gentle prompt, a dream, a conversation with someone, or a dramatic intervention like mine. But rest assured, if you knock, the door will be opened. God's desire is that none should perish, but that everyone should come to the knowledge of the truth. Today, I share my story because I was commanded to do so. In that spiritual realm, I was told to go back, bear witness, and offer people a warning and a hope. The warning is that many are on a wide road leading to destruction, often convinced they are right when they are not. The hope is that Christ welcomes anyone who repents and believes in him, receiving baptism, and living within the fullness of the true faith. If this testimony has touched you, if it resonates with questions you've already been asking, please consider opening your heart to the possibility that there might be more to reality than what you have been taught. I speak from first-hand experience. The illusions can be so pervasive that they feel like absolute truth until you cross that threshold and see with spiritual eyes. Once you do, there is no going back. Though it may cost you friendships, community standing, or even family harmony, the exchange is worth it. Eternity is at stake, and no earthly comfort can compare to the joy of truly knowing God, receiving his grace, and avoiding the eternal separation that comes with rejecting him. I look at my life now, a house filled with tension, a job I return to with new eyes, a future uncertain by worldly standards, and I am still filled with peace. That peace is not of this world. It flows from the sure knowledge that, no matter what happens, I am held in the embrace of the God who revealed himself to me. Even in sorrow, my heart sings with praise for the one who saved me from the brink of everlasting darkness. Sometimes I kneel in the quiet of my bedroom, whispering words of thanks in both English and Arabic, not out of ritual or compulsion, but out of love. The words come spontaneously. My Lord and my God, thank you for setting me free. My journey continues. Perhaps one day, Hassan's heart might soften. Perhaps he too, will come to understand who Jesus really is. Perhaps my children, as they grow older, will recall the transformation they witnessed in their mother and decide to explore the Christian faith for themselves. I pray for this daily, not with the mechanical repetitiveness of Islamic prayer, but with the ardent supplication of a believer, confident in the mercy and power of the living God. I also pray for those who still do not know, or who have heard but refuse to believe. The same love that saved me when I was literally dead can save them too. That love is relentless, going to the greatest lengths, even allowing the creator of the universe to suffer on a cross, to bring his creatures back into relationship with himself. The story of Jesus is not just a religious tale, it is the cosmic reality that undergirds all existence. That reality is personally accessible to anyone willing to surrender their pride and preconceived notions. Before my near-death experience, I thought I had all the answers. I was so assured of my own righteousness, so sure that my path was the final one. But standing on the threshold of eternity revealed how small and fragile my religious construct really was. It is my hope that by sharing these words, by laying bare both the terror of a fiery hell and the splendor of a loving, incarnate God, others might heed the call without having to go through the same literal brush with death. If reading my testimony spares even one soul from walking confidently down a path leading straight to eternal separation, then every moment of ostracism and heartbreak I have endured since returning is well worth it. Even now, as I write these closing lines, I recall vividly the feeling of leaving my body in that basement. The paramedics, the swirling darkness, the frantic voices. It is like a memory carved into my very being, forever reminding me of the fragility of life and the reality of what lies beyond. If you have felt a stirring within you while reading this, please don't ignore it. Investigate, pray, ask, open your heart. The promise is true. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened. If this story has touched you, please like and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on more incredible testimonies of truth. Your support helps us reach others who need to hear these life-changing messages.